And I actually think it's probably best if I let him explain what that means. So, Michael, let me know if you don't
Yeah,
have
let
permission to share your
me
screen.
see. I can share my screen.
Excellent.
Okay, so we're gonna share this one.
Just a quick commentary on this. I just shared Michael's presentation at my work, at my day job, because I wanted them to know how cool this idea was. And this is something that can help you today. So I recommend paying good attention to this.
Okay. So I'm Michael Madsen. I'm lead technologist for InMoment, and this is reactive responsive design. So I have my GitHub that's MGM87, and then my Twitter's mmadsen87. On my GitHub, I have the code that we're going to be looking at here as well. So if you wanted to look at that, you can find it there. So reactive responsive design. Let's jump in. So first, let's define what responsive design is. So responsive design is a UI that reacts to your screen size. It typically depends on media queries, and the problem is media queries are a mess, and there's not really a way to get around them. It doesn't matter like what type of library you're using, like even using Bootstrap, internally it's going to be using media queries to decide what those elements look like. So we're kind of stuck with media queries, but we don't have to feel stuck with media queries. And that's what we're going to look at here. So first, let's talk about how media queries are a mess. Some people look at me like I'm crazy when I say that. Some people will fight with me a little bit, but it's hard to argue with these points. First one is there's no organization. So this is a issue I have with media queries, is that if you're looking at a large CSS file and there's like 5 media queries, there's a couple ways you can tackle this. One way is you have your @media decorator in your CSS and all the classes under it for that screen size, and then you have a similar thing following it for another screen size, and then again for another screen size. And so if there's a issue and you kind of want to see all of the like classes for your title, you've got to go like to like 5-6 places all throughout your CSS file. It makes it kind of irritating to try to work on. I have an example of what this looks like here. So this is what you'll see, and imagine this instead being like 1,000 lines long, but you got title here, and then title here, and title here, title here, title here. And so if there's something you need to update in all of them or something like that, you've got to jump around a bunch. It's kind of a pain. Some people do this. This is crazy though, right? Like they'll put the title all together and they'll have the media query selector lined up for the classes that need to change for that selector. And that just is like super bloated and sucks to read, but all your titles are all grouped, which is nice, I suppose. But neither of these is optimal. So that's the first way media queries are a mess, is there's no defined right way to organize them. The next thing is different queries. So this is more of an issue if you have a large team. So you have a bunch of devs. Maybe some people are working on some sort of like frame for the application. Another group is working for, the stuff that's going inside that frame. And so what happens if they get their media queries out of sync? Well, it's going to look really weird if your application is switching to like a mobile or like tablet view and relaying out that frame, and then your interior is breaking at a different point, things like that. So you can run into situations where if someone's not diligent with like code reviews or it's not well documented, it's easy to get out of sync and get like weird breakpoints throughout your application. Another problem is that media queries can only deal with your screen width. So if you ever have a complex layout and you want to do different things dependent on the width of an element or something like that, you're kind of out of luck without mixing in some other, process to figure that out. But then you have the rest of your page going by media queries, and then the special thing for these special cases. It's just not really maintainable, and everyone will implement it differently. Another issue, and this is one of my biggest issues, is that components always load. So if you think about it, your app is going to be used by a lot of people, but the least performant machines that could be running your app are typically phones, right? And the way web development often works is you make your app and you try to make it responsive, but typically you're hiding things from the, full screen web page version of the app when you're looking at it on a mobile device. Well, if you're using media queries just hide elements. So if you had some sort of component that was large or required a bunch of data to download, or some sort of constraints like that, that component that is actually going to still generate and be put onto the DOM, but hidden by the CSS with the media queries. And so in effect, what you're doing is you're putting the heaviest load that your application is going to have onto phones, which are the lowest end device running your app, because it's doing all the stuff for the desktop version, but then doing also all the stuff for the mobile version. So that's a big problem I have with media queries. And then it's hard to test media queries without resorting to something like visual regression testing, where you're taking pictures and comparing them against other pictures, which isn't always fun. It'd be nice to, be able to do that in code in a reasonable way. So what do we do? There's a bunch of problems with media queries. They're kind of a mess. Well, digging into it, we have this function on window called match media, and match media allows you to pass it a media query, and window can watch for that media query. And then we give that match media, we add a listener that you hand a callback function, and that callback function gets called whenever that media query is hit or not hit anymore. So with those two pieces, that gives us a way that we can throw Rxjs in there to start tracking these queries, okay? So Rxjs. Now, screen sizes. Okay, so track the screen size. We want to track the screen size in an observable. Then subscribe to that observable to detect screen sizes throughout your app. So if you're following so far, we're going to use window match media with the callback to basically turn these media queries being met or not into an observable we can watch throughout our app. So there's a library that I wrote to manage this, so you don't have to worry about the implementation of how this works, called Rxrs. This is platform independent, and I have a couple Medium articles out in the ngconf publication about this. So if you're doing React or something, you can just use Rxrs. There's an additional library for Angular that gives you like a nice service that has default settings and stuff that you might want. And I'll give you a look at what this looks like, actually. So this slideshow is actually from, I gave a talk at Rxjs Live about this. And this is before I had like nice helper services around this. So I kind of walked everyone through how to make one of these services. But I'll just show you what this kind of looks like. And again, there's a framework agnostic version available. And so like kind of the meat of the code is in there. But I just, I took normal screen size breakpoints from Material Design, just Google's page about that, and made some generalized breakpoints. And then built that into kind of we have a couple interfaces. So you can either watch, hey, what size do I have? Like you can subscribe and say, hey, I want to know what size it is. Like, is it extra small? Is it medium? Is it extra large? or there's one that will tell you like the whole set of them, like whether they're met or not. The Angular version just kind of lays on top of that raw JavaScript service and gets it working with Zone properly. But there's a couple things going on in here. First, we have the sizes observable. So here's kind of our interface. Rxrs service is there in case you need to give it your own screen sizes to watch. And really, it will take any media query you can write. So there's a lot of fancy media queries out there, like, hey, does this person have touch input and things like that? Like you could track that with this as well. But this is focused mostly on screen widths, but you can throw that into the service. There's like a Boolean observable for mobile and tablet states. Sometimes that's useful. And then sizes is your full screen widths, which is right here. So it's going to be each of those sizes and then the Boolean of whether it's met or not. And then the other one is just the enum, which is just going to tell you extra small, small, medium, large, or extra large. So just some boilerplate setup. And this will give us all the observables that we need to start working with this. Okay. So Rxjs to the rescue. Now we're going to look at how this works out to all of our problems with media queries just in our CSS. First, you decide where your code is. This comes out to you can group your classes together if you want to. So if we look here, when we looked at these other examples, like it's a pain to look at it here because your classes are strewn throughout your application. This is just a mess to read, but at least your classes are together. With this, you end up with something more like, am I looking at it? Yeah. So here we go. Here's our sidebar, right? And then here's our sidebar extra small class. So we don't have to have media queries in the CSS. We just have our CSS selectors in here. And so we can stick all of our sidebar classes together or any other classes that we might have. There's probably more in here. Yeah, so here's a title, and here's our title extra small, title medium, large, and extra large. So we don't have any of that media query mumbo jumbo in here, and we can keep all of our classes together so they're easy to look at and work with when we need to. We can look at what this app looks like here. So here's the title, and I'll just use F12. Let me see. So the title up here, you'll see as I move this up and down, it's just going to update, but this is all through, like you see this layout just updating as I move this around. All the updates in here are through the RS. So you decide where your code is, so we can group it together like we want to. Next, you decide an app's breakpoints. So this is something that I'm a little passionate about. I've done enterprise development my whole career, and there's a lot of little practices that I'm like, yes, this is enterprise development. And then you go someplace and you're like, well, these people said enterprise development, but this is actually like a circus, right? And so this is one of those things where it's like, okay, on the one hand, we talked about how teams can get mismatched on their breakpoints. Well, okay, next step is you define the breakpoints somewhere, Confluence or whatever. But let's be honest, developers don't read Confluence, and they're just going to do whatever they do. And so then it falls on like the people doing the PRs to catch it and educate, because no one's going to read the Confluence document. So it's up to the PR people to know what's in there. So it's always best to be able to have code enforce your standards rather than people enforcing your standards. It also frees up your time. So by removing the breakpoints out of our CSS, they are now in TypeScript. And that means we define our breakpoints. And if you're just using the service, they're all defined for you already in the first place. If you need to add more, you're just going to have your own service that defines those breakpoints instead. And so when someone comes into this, they're going to be like, I'm going to use large, small, whatever, rather than, typing in all of their breakpoints. So you decide that breakpoints, that's through the service we were looking at a minute ago. And now we can account for complex layouts. So like I said before, if you only care about screen width, it's fine, media queries work for you. But if you are concerned about other things going on the page, you're kind of out of luck. So if we open this app, we've got a couple things going on. And I actually, I had a project at work where they wanted something like this, where like, oh, if we had this panel open, it should affect these cards over here. So like if we say at this much space, the cards need to stack differently, right? So if we have it about here, and I say open filters, it would, I want those cards to readjust to like the mobile size, right? So there's enough room that I don't really want the filter panel to come out over the entire screen. So maybe this is like on a tablet or something, but if you were just using normal CSS selectors, you would not be able to do something like this. You'd have to engineer something else to handle this. But because we're using this Rxrs, we're using the same process for everything, which makes it easier to understand and more maintainable, but also gives us flexibility. So also, if we open this up more, we have this side and this side. So a similar thing happens here. So we have a pretty complex layout here. But what does this look like? I don't know if anyone's ever had to mess around with something like this, but it gets very confusing if you're trying to work it out and you have media queries in the mix in your CSS. Here, and this might take a second to digest, but oh, where's my component? There we go. Here's my main dashboard component. When I have these complex layouts, sometimes I'll make an interface. So I'm like, okay, this is like my view state. I'm basically building a view state for myself. Okay. Yeah, so here I have main dashboard view state. So I have cards going on here. I have this filter class. I have isMobile. So this is information that my template is going to use to do its layout instead of just throwing a bunch of selectors in the CSS. If I come up here, because this is in a observable, we can now pipe it with other information we have in observables. So things like, is the filter panel open? Is the side nav open? Those kinds of things. So we can see I'm using a combined latest here. And I have the sizes. I have isMobile also from the screen side service. I have the side nav open, and I have the filter panel open. And with those 4 things, I can make some more complex decisions about how I want these cards to lay out. So the big change in this layout is that this CSS grid is being laid out differently, just to display how this is working. So if the size is extra small, or the size is small and the side nav is open, then we're gonna lay out that grid this way and set the filter classes and whatnot. So you can see we can make more complex decisions about how we want to set up that page. And this is all done in our TypeScript. And what that means is that we can write tests around this to ensure that our view state is getting sent to the page the way we expect it to, okay? So that improves testability. If we look over here at the HTML, it's nice because now we just look at the view state and use async pipe and say the cards. And so this is very clean for having a mat or having a CSS grid that's like updating like it is. So that's very nice and clean, and we're able to account for very like the complexity of the layout is between you and your designers, but you can account for it in code here. Let's see. Next thing, you can load components only when needed. So this is, like I said, the one that I'm quite passionate about. And so if you have a big component that you don't want to show up in your mobile one, I just have this component. It's not actually a big component. It just says it's a big component, but we don't want it to actually generate when we hit mobile screens. So once we get down here, like it's still there, and we can see like this is our mobile layout here, but it isn't, we're not to the mobile size yet. Oh, press the wrong button, come on. But if I make this a little more narrow, that component's not there anymore. If I make it wide again, there's the component. But because this is behind the ngIf, we'll see that that component is no longer on the DOM if we get smaller. It's just gone. So that means on your phones, anything that the CSS would hide, you're actually not even generating. So those are the nice things. A couple things about usage. I showed you the CSS file where, oh, where'd it go? Here we go. The CSS file where we're grouping our classes. So like here's filter container, extra small, medium. If we look at the template, like here's one way we can handle those classes. Where's my ng? Okay, so here's class, filter container, and then we also do filter container, useState, async, filter class. So you're always gonna have the filter container class, and then you will dynamically have one of these other classes as well, and that's how you handle the classes that you need for other sizes. So that also ends up, like this is pretty smooth, like you don't even need to use like ng class or anything like that because the templating just takes care of it. So that is all nice and clean, which is what I'm always looking for my teams. And then you can test your layouts, like I said before, because it's all in observables now. That means that we can do all sorts of things to test those observables and see that we're getting what we want. If you wanted to still do like a visual regression test, you could, but you do have confidence that the view state that you're sending to your template is what you expect it to be. So that is Rxrs in a nutshell. Yeah, I didn't need to do that. I just wanted to turn on my last slide. There we go. That's the end. So I'll open it up for some questions.
That was so cool. And like, as you're presenting, I'm just thinking of all the like other ways that you can use it. And like, it just looks like it's an incredibly powerful and flexible tool, which is really great.
Yeah, it was really funny when I presented this at Rxjs Live. There was a guy there that works for like the Stars. He works for Stars, the like cable channel, and they were. He's on the team building their like their app for online and whatnot, similar to any streaming platform. And he was like, I fell into this so bad because you started out and you're like, people say you're crazy when you say you don't like like the media queries. I was like, media queries are fine. We've had them forever. And then you started talking about what's wrong with them. I was like, yeah, that is wrong with them. And then like he just was like, I just followed along. But it was interesting because he was like, I'm going to take this back to Stars and talk to them because they have a lot of interesting things based on based on screen sizes, like what videos they want to present you with to watch and things like that. And he's like, this is nuts because all this configuration that they have to make those decisions, he's like, that could all be wrapped into like, a lot of it can be wrapped into this screen size stuff. And a lot of those decisions are taken off of a lot of code that they've had to write to handle that kind of thing. So like, there's some pretty creative uses that you could put to this. Yeah, it's kind of neat.
Yeah, for sure. Are there any questions for Michael?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go for it.
I have a question. What do you say to those people who use Bootstrap and Tailwind and who never write media queries but do it through frameworks?
I mean, that's okay. It's less flexible, right? So things like Bootstrap and Tailwind, it can save you time and it can save like your organization time if people understand what's going on. But it's when you run into, oh, we have a really complex layout. How do we support that? Well, this might be the way you support it, and you use Tailwind and this or something like that. But it's really about where I've worked. Designers like to come up with some pretty nutty ideas, not just where I work now, but like elsewhere. And no one, like executives, typically don't like to be told no about that because they're usually signing off on those designs. But this gives me the tools that I can handle that. Yeah, but I don't have a problem with people using Bootstrap or Tailwind to simplify their CSS because CSS is garbage. But no, I
People say that
don't like
still hides
CSS.
it
But
instead of
yeah.
not using NGF. Instead of that, it hides stuff. So your point still sticks even with the framework about that one thing. But I agree. That makes sense.
But yeah, the NGF thing, like I said, that's a big concern of mine. And so anytime that I'm like, I want to hide something, I would not want to do that with CSS or Bootstrap or Tailwind or anything like that.
Especially if you have like a giant table or a component that has stuff calling for data.
And there's ways to optimize it, right? Like if you set up your component so like, oh yeah, it can generate, but it doesn't like request all the data it needs unless something else happens that only happens if it's not hidden. I mean, so you can work around it, but it's much
But who does
easier to
that?
just say don't have it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know most developers I know wouldn't even think to do that. So it's a good point.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've worked with it or not, but did you take any inspiration from the Breakpoint Observer that Angular Material has?
Yeah. So when I wrote this the first time, it was just based off of Breakpoint Observer. And like, you're like one of two people I've met that ever knew about Breakpoint Observer that I didn't tell about it. Also, back then, I don't know if it's improved, but the documentation on it was pretty hazy as well, like a lot of the CDK.
Yeah, I mean, CDK is lacking just generally for the most part.
Yeah.
But like, I didn't, just reading the documentation for Breakpoint Observer, I didn't know that the window match thing, I didn't know that existed. So I always wondered how Breakpoint Observer did it.
Yeah. So I went and read their source code and kind of like boiled it down. So like they have a lot more stuff going on in there. I don't know exactly what all of it's doing because I mean, this does everything that I expect Breakpoint Observer to do. But I also was like, there's a need for this everywhere, not just Angular. So like you could use this in just a JavaScript page if you wanted to, right? As long as you have Rxjs, because it's kind of built around having that.
I wouldn't you want to use Rxjs in a plain JavaScript page, but
but you could. Yeah. Yep. So I wanted to make something that was like universal. It's very, very small, and then I put made the service so that people kind of had default settings, because that's something that the CDK also didn't offer. Is it's like, hey, here's this thing, have fun figuring out how to use it, and there's no defaults, right? So
it's pretty standard CDK.
Yeah. So this gives you some defaults and a little bit of help figuring it out.
Cool.
It's funny Jay that you mentioned that, because I remember when I first was reading Michael's article with the ngconf publication on this, when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is just the material Breakpoint Observer. And then I started reading, I'm like, no, this is even better than the Breakpoint Observer. But even like when I thought it was just going to be like the exact same, I was like, well, this is exciting because we use the Breakpoint Observer, but we were moving off material. And so I was like, well, now I'm going to have to lose the Breakpoint Observer, but now I don't. And you actually can gain a lot more with this.
Yeah, it's very similar. You could use it the same way. It's not like drop-in replacement. You'll have to update what your commands or whatever, but
it's has feature parity.
Yeah.
Alex, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna hitch on like the Breakpoint Observer. So because like relatively like we're just like in most of the examples, it's really on like hide show. But like in terms of like scaling on like functional responsiveness, like for example, you remember like when you open the filter, and then like I don't want to like instead of hiding like filling out the half of the space, like functionally I want it to like overlay it instead. Like, would that work in terms of like using Rx? What was the acronym again? I kind of
Yeah,
forgot.
Rxrs. So Rxrs, so that stands for like reactive responsive. So Rx for Rxjs, and then RS just because abbreviating it. But yeah, so like what you're saying is kind of that would be kind of like the default function. So my special layout stuff, that's to support relaying out when you open that filter thing. If you had a case for the filters overlaying over everything, well, you wouldn't even need to change what's going on in the page behind it. It would just overlay over the top, and that's kind of like the default way that it would work. So it just gives you flexibility that if you wanted to do something more complex, you could, but it still operates the same way you would expect it would without it. So like I'm using material in that example, and that overlay thing, well, I'm just using the, what is it, the side nav. And so I'm doing I can't remember all the terminology it uses, like push, which pushes it over. If I said over and just updated, let me see, I don't remember because I wrote this a while ago, but if I just said over on that side nav and then updated like this, like we don't care if the side nav is open, so we just say, oh, if it's small, if it's extra small, yeah, just extra small, yeah. If it's extra small, then do that size. So we just remove this portion, and then any of these where it says side nav open, you probably just remove anything that says that, disregard it, because now you're going over the top and it doesn't matter. And then this should work. I could try it. I don't know what we'd be looking at though.
I have an idea.
Hmm.
You should submit this to Angular team to add to the CDK. I don't know if that would fit, but if it could, that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I think maybe, but like the CDK so far, it seems like they shy away from like any sort of like scaffolding for you. It's like you implement it however you want, and this is more of a this is the way I want type of thing. So I mean, I haven't seen anything like that in the CDK, so I'd just be.
Maybe they should change that. Maybe that's why people don't know about the CDK.
Possibly true.
I think people know about it. They just give up on it.
I remember opening the CDK and just being like, "Oh, that's cool," and then just leaving. Like I've done that at least 5 times, and so I use it when I need it. But
yeah, there's like 2 things that people use out of there, like drag and drop, and another one
virtual
probably.
scroll.
Yeah, maybe virtual scroll. Yeah, virtual scroll.
One of those.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. Any other questions for Michael or Jay?
Is that the real slave one behind you?
Is the real slave one from the movies. Predates Mandalorian.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much, Michael. That was really awesome.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jay. That honestly, both talks tonight were so great and really useful. And then, Michael, I love that just like Jay's talk sort of had a sneak demo of the Chrome Redux DevTools, whatever the correct name for that is. I feel like your talk kind of had like a sneak demo of like, hey, this is a great way to do reactive